House Leader. Orders of the day. Ordre du jour first.
I moved, seconded by the Minister for Canadian Heritage, that in relation to Bill C-18, an act respecting online communication platforms that make news content available to persons in Canada, not more than 5 further sitting hours shall be allotted to the stage of consideration of Senate amendments to the bill, and that at the expiry of the 5 hours provided for the consideration of the said stage of the bill, any proceedings before the House shall be interrupted, if required for the purpose of this order, and in turn every question necessary for the disposal of the said stage of the bill then under consideration shall be put forthwith and successively without further debate or amendment. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Good idea.
Mr. Holland, appuyé par Mr. Rodriguez.
Mr. Holland, seconded by Mr. Rodriguez, moves.
Bill C-18, an act respecting online communications platforms that make news content available to persons in Canada, not more than 5 further hours shall be allotted to the stage of consideration of Senate amendments to the bill, and that the expiry of the 5 hours provided for the consideration of the said stage of the said bill, any proceedings before the House shall be interrupted if required for the purpose of this order, and in turn every question necessary for the disposal of the said stage of the bill then under consideration shall be put forthwith and successively without further debate or amendment. Conformément à l'article 60.
Pursuant to Standing Order 67-1, there will now be a 30-minute question and answer period. All members who wish to ask questions should now rise or use the raise hand function so that the speaker can have a general idea of the number of members wishing to participate.
I got like 5 or 6. We have everybody.
Perfect. Merci.
Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This bill deals with a very important topic, which is the sustainability of journalism in Canada. There have been many stakeholders from across the country that have expressed deep concerns, and I also note that at various stages of debate, there are many witnesses from different regions, different demographics that participate in media in Canada that were not allowed to testify at committee. My concern is that if the government is curtailing debate on this without a chance for every member to speak to the amendments that the government is suggesting that they either will or will not support, that the voices of regional Canadians who are engaged in the media will not have a chance to be aptly debated in the House. So I'm wondering, with the decline of local media in Canada, why the government is choosing to curtail debate on a bill that could, in fact, have some censorship provisions at this juncture. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Here we go again. I'll start by sharing I have supported time allocation in the past. On the Budget Implementation Act, for example, it took us months to get through it, and it got to the point where I felt it was appropriate to say, okay, we're hearing the same speeches over and over again, let's move on. I also just finished supporting moving to orders of the day because I also recognize we're at a time when there are a lot of partisan antics going on here. That being said, this is the 4th day in a row of sitting days where we're voting on limiting debate again. In this case, the Senate amendments came back last night. We've heard one speech from the minister, one from the official opposition, and now we're being told to limit debate again. My question to the minister is, does he recognize the implications that this approach has on our democracy?
Melville.
Madam Speaker, and I just find this incredibly rich in the wrong sense of the word to hear this conversation going on about our small local news outlets and whatnot. This is absolutely not true. Never there, this government, for the smaller entities that represent our communities, and they have asked and asked for support and have gotten next to nothing. As a matter of fact, with our local papers, they're required to even put on each one how much funding they've received from Heritage, which is minuscule compared to the billions of dollars this government has handed out to the big guys. So I have trouble with the fact that we're shutting down debate on this issue, and I'm not hearing what is accurate according to my writing for sure from that member over there.
Leader?
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I wonder if the Minister can reflect on the statements when the Leader of the Conservative Party has a press conference and he says, this is in regards to the budget bill, that he is going to speak and speak and speak and speak and speak. His intentions were to prevent the bill from passing until the Prime Minister made changes. We changed the budget, Madam Speaker. Then we have the Conservatives now that oppose this particular bill, and they've already expressed an interest in terms of speaking and speaking and speaking in order to prevent the bill from passing. Would the Minister not agree, just like the time allocation with the Leader of the Conservative Party, who vowed to speak endlessly? Without the time allocation, we would never have been able to pass the budget. Without the time allocation, we would not be able to pass C-18. Would the member provide his thoughts on that issue?
Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just wanted to come back to the Minister's sanguine reaction. He's very passionate about this, but I think he misunderstood my question. I want to focus on the notion of time allocation motion. Only 10 have been approved by the Bloc Quebecois, and we only said yes when it was essential for a bill to be adopted rapidly in 2021, C-10. It was the Bloc that moved time allocation publicly. They went to the Liberals and said, hey, let's have a time allocation, because the government was not in control of their agenda, so we had to do something to unblock this bill. And now the government isn't out of control with C-18. Everything seems to be going well. We're at the final stage, so we don't need to unclog something that isn't clogged. So my question is as follows. This week, there are still a few days to debate C-18. Yes, I want it to be adopted this week at all costs. But my question is, has the Minister lost all hope that this can be done normally by the end of the week? And is that the reason for which he has imposed time allocation today? That was my question. I'd like to hear the Minister on the matter.
Incredibly rich coming from the Minister who used to decry when he was in opposition any motions of closure. You know, I want to point out, Madam Speaker, that from the time of Tommy Douglas to the time of Thomas Mulcair, over those 14 parliaments, the NDP only supported closure 17 times. Well, with today's vote, we're over 40 times in the past 2 years that the NDP have supported their Liberal partners in shutting down democracy and debate in this Parliament. That is shameful behavior. And how can the NDP stand over there and decry me now and heckle me while they're supporting one of the most unethical and one most corrupt governments that we've seen in Canadian history? Now, on the issue of the bill, Madam Speaker, I'll just say this. The Minister stands here and says he's supporting local media. I can tell you that this government hasn't supported our local community newspapers. They haven't stood up for local content creators. And by going forward with this bill, they're putting more powers in the hands of Rogers and Bell and CBC rather than actually supporting those local content creators and demising our democracy in this country by shutting down freedom of the press through this bill by cutting off the voices of those who want to be independent on internet. That is unacceptable. I
just want to remind members not to be heckling or trying to yell out answers or questions while others have the floor. The Honourable Minister.
Well, this bill, Madam Speaker, is there exactly for the different medias in our communities. But I said it. It's not the only thing the government is doing. We put in place a tax a tax credit on labor to help our newsrooms. This is money for our newsrooms. We put in place also the local journalist initiative for the small outlets in the different regions. Why? Because they're absolutely essential. We have the Canada Periodical Funds. Those are three key programs, and this comes to reinforce that, Madam Speaker. We've met with local small media outlets from across the country, from each of the ridings, from everywhere. And they want this bill. The other thing that it's in this bill, the bill allows for collective bargaining. So those small media outlets, they can get together 5, 10, 100 if they want, and negotiate as a group with the big tech giants, because of course there's this power imbalance there. So this bill is extremely important for those small media outlets. And if you look at what happened in Australia, because they have a similar bill in place, well, proportionally, the small media outlet got more than the big ones.
Burnaby.
Thanks very much, Madam Speaker. The two of the key witnesses that came forward on C-18, and there was, as my colleague from Drummondville just mentioned, we had literally dozens and dozens and dozens of witnesses. Two of the key witnesses were the Alberta Community Newspaper Association and the Saskatchewan Community Newspaper Association. Now, these newspapers, independent outlets right across Alberta and Saskatchewan, are the ones that cover the cities that cover half of the Conservative caucus. And they said C-18 needs to be put in place, adopted as quickly as possible. So I want to ask my colleague, the minister, you've got Alberta community newspapers and Saskatchewan community newspapers saying the bill needs to be brought in, and you've got Conservative MPs that represent those ridings fighting tooth and nail to block this bill completely, refusing to allow it through. That seems to me to be hypocrisy and a clear contradiction in what Conservative MPs should be defending, which is their community's interests. So why is it that Conservatives are blocking a bill that their community newspapers are calling for? There is no respect for democracy in blocking every piece of legislation that a majority of members of Parliament want to adopt, and that's what Conservatives have done systematically. I remember the dismal decade of the Harper regime. 150 times the Conservatives imposed closure and destroying pensions, environmental protection, all kinds of awful things. Here we have a bill that is supported heavily by Alberta community newspapers, Saskatchewan community newspapers. They've been saying for months it needs to be brought in. How can you represent Grand Prairie, Red Deer, Lethbridge, Prince Albert, Moose Jaw, North Battleford, Medicine Hat, Swift Current? How can you represent those communities and block bills that those community newspapers are calling for? It makes no sense at all. So my comment, my question to the minister is simply this: why are Conservatives blocking something that's good for their communities and good for their community newspapers?
Bernie.
Madam Speaker, and Madam Speaker, this debate is important in my riding. I met with Terry Farrell from the Comox Valley Record. I met with Peter Macaulay from the PQB News, and they talked about the sense of urgency right now that they can't compete with the Googles and the Facebooks, Madam Speaker. And what happened? They just had to lay off Scott Stansfield, one of the top local reporters, Madam Speaker, in the Comox Valley, who's covered really important, critical stories. Now they're short-staffed. They don't have the capacity to cover as much as they'd like to make sure that the people in our communities are well informed, and they're at a disadvantage, Madam Speaker. Really what we're seeing from the Conservatives and finding out is that they are the gatekeepers for Google, for Facebook, and the big web giants, Madam Speaker. And so through you, Madam Speaker, to the Minister, can he speak about this sense of urgency? Because Scott Stansfield losing his job, and we know there's going to be more, Madam Speaker, if we don't get this legislation passed and we don't make sure that they get the proper financial supports so that they can actually produce good local media in our communities.
Hear, hear.
The minister has disingenuinely stated that this bill is about helping local newspapers, when in fact the parliamentary budget officer, who is a non-partisan figure of this place, has reported that actually this bill, to the tune of 75% of the funding, will go toward CBC, Bell Media, and Rogers. These are the three big broadcasters. I'd like to ask the minister, does that sound like newspapers to him? Because it sure doesn't to me. And to the honourable member who went before me, to his point, our local newspapers in ridings like Lethbridge, where you have towns like Picture Butte or Coaldale or Colehurst that are trying to make a go of it with one journalist, this bill leaves them out in the cold. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, across this country that are in a similar boat. So does that sound like supporting local news to the minister?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, that's a big rich coming from the person that quoted the tech giants all the time. She was using their speaking points all the time from day one, Madam Speaker. That's really rich coming from her. We're there to support mediums in all communities. And also, if you look at the example in Australia, the system we're basing ourselves on.
I want to remind the Honourable Member for Lethbridge, she had an opportunity to ask a question. Whether she likes the response or not, she shouldn't be heckling or trying to ask other questions. The Honourable Minister.
That was very impolite, Madam Speaker.
I would ask the Honourable Member for Lethbridge, if she doesn't want to abide by the rules of the House, then she can step out of into the lobby instead and air her views there. The Honourable Minister.
Madam Speaker. So if when we look at the example of Australia, which is similar to our bill,
again, the Honourable Member for Lethbridge is not really respecting the rules of the House. And if she continues, she will not be recognized for any questions or comments for the rest of the day. The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So as I was saying, in Australia, when you look at the results at the end of the day, when all the deals were concluded, proportionally, small media got more money than any of the big media. That's a big example.
Oh, the Honourable Member for Lethbridge will not be recognized for the rest of the day. A point of order, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, even in a heckle, the member from Lethbridge used a very unparliamentary word, and I know you've already indicated that she wouldn't be recognized, but I do believe she owes an apology for using the word lie.
Honourable Member for Lethbridge, does she want to, can she please apologize? I'm acknowledging you to apologize, and I would ask the Honourable Member to rise.
I said that the Minister lied.
And I'm asking the Honourable Member to apologize.
I'll apologize for using that word. He misinformed the House.
I would ask the Honourable, I would remind the Honourable Member that that apology is not quite what we were looking for. But again, I do want to remind all members that there is a respect for that there are rules of the House, and the rules of the House is to respect the members who are speaking, whether we like the answers or not. And to be challenging the chair and not respecting the rules of the chair is not acceptable as well. And so I just, again, want to reiterate that the honourable member will not be recognized for the rest of the day for questions and comments. It is... Il est de mon devoir d'interrompre.
It is my duty to interrupt the proceedings at this time and put forth the question on the motion now before the House. The question is as follows.
Monsieur Holland, appuyé par Monsieur...
Mr. Holland, seconded by Mr. Rodriguez, moved that in relation to Bill C-18, an act respecting online communications platforms that make news content available to persons in Canada, not more than 5 further hours shall be allotted to the stage of consideration of Senate amendments to the bill.
Shall I dispense? No. That at the expiry of the 5 hours provided for the consideration of the said stage of the said bill, any proceedings before the House shall be interrupted, if required for the purpose of the order, and in turn, every question necessary for the disposal of the said stage of the bill shall be put forthwith and successively without further debate or amendment. Si un député d'un parti...
If a member of a recognised party present in the House wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the Chair.
Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Madam Speaker, I would request a recorded vote, please.
The members.
The question is as follows. Mr. Holland,
Mr. Holland, seconded by Mr. Rodriguez, moves that in relation to Bill C-18, Online News Act, not more than 5 hours be allotted to study of the Senate amendments to this bill.
Consideration of the said bill, stage of the said bill. Any proceedings before the House shall be interrupted if required for the purpose of this order, and in turn, every question necessary for the disposal of the said stage of the bill shall be put forthwith and successively without further debate or amendment. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically is started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. For all those in favor of the motion, will please rise.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Holland.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Mr. Rodriguez.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Monsieur Lamoureux.
Monsieur Lamoureux.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Ms. de Brusen.
Ms. de Brusen.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Ms. Suds.
Ms. Suds.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Chahal.
Mr. Chahal.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Blaney.
Ms. Blaney.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack. All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Bezan.
Mr. Bezan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Ms. Findley.
Ms. Findley.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Morant.
Mrs. Wagantall.
Mrs. Wagantall.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Falk, Provencher.
Mr. Falk, Provencher.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Leipert.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Monsieur Champoux.
Monsieur Champoux.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Saint-Clair Desgagnés.
Madame Saint-Clair Desgagnés.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Chabot.
The House will now await the end of the electronic voting period.
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members are not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may use the raise hand function, and the chair will recognize them. Monsieur Deltel.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. Malheureusement, j'ai eu un problème avec ma facilité. Ma caméra n'a pas fonctionné. J'inscris un vote contre.
Okay, let's just cut it for a sec. Hold on. On a du feedback. On a quelque chose d'autre qui est en ligne, là. Okay. Just wait for a second. On va attendre pour un moment. OK, réessayer.
Demandons à M. Deltel de nous donner une signe avec ça.
OK, M. Deltel, si tu veux me donner un thumbs up ou un thumbs down.
Le problème avec ma caméra, donc je n'ai pas pu enregistrer mon vote. Mon vote est contre.
Contre. Monsieur El-Khoury.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Si j'ai eu un problème technique, je vote oui.
El-Khoury, yay pour. Quelqu'un d'autre? Voilà. Le bureau va maintenant compiler les...
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 170, 170. Nays contre 144, 144.
I declare the motion carried.